Today, what I want to talk about is how we can navigate the fact that at least some of our students are seeing some misinformation about the stuff that we know is factual on TikTok. And so my quick polling question for you, just a yes or no question that you can throw in the chat. Are you seeing students in your classrooms coming in with some misconceptions about psychological science because of what they see on TikTok? Just a quick yes or no, or different things that you've seen come up in people's TikToking. This is the kind of thing I was actually seeing a lot in my own classroom, especially teaching a class specifically on happiness. I was getting a lot of misinformation that students were seeing online about mental health and so on. And that caused me, even though I'm not on TikTok myself, to do a little bit of a deep dive into what my students were actually seeing. And this is just today's top psychology posts on TikTok. And you'll see things like the fact that they're talking about dark psychology and EDMR and all these things that I think we don't necessarily see as like massive topics in psychology. But this is the kind of thing our students are seeing a lot. And it made me really worried. It actually made me worried about the kind of thing they're seeing, their ability to tell the difference between stuff that's real and the stuff that's fake. And it got me really thinking a lot about what we're training our students to think about when they are going online, but also the way that we get our students to communicate themselves online. Because of course, something that you know about TikTok is that our students aren't just the consumers of the content they see on TikTok, they're also oftentimes creating that content as well. And so if you do a deep dive onto what our students are learning when it comes to mental health content on TikTok, there's a lot of misinformation there. Actually, not great studies that I could find on this, but there was a recent poll from The Guardian where The Guardian went on TikTok, took the top 100 mental health tips, so hashtag mental health tips on TikTok that were up there, and gave them to clinicians and psychiatrists and asked, is this stuff real? And what you find is around 60% of the content in the top tips that people are seeing on TikTok are just complete BS. Perhaps not surprising, but our students are seeing lots and lots of misinformation. And these are the forms of misinformation that was identified, right? I think something June will talk about a lot, this idea that there's a lot of pathologizing about negative emotions. People are missing the correct language for therapeutic concepts, lots of fake treatments that are peddled as evidence-based when they're not, and lots of just teaching our students that what you can use to sort of say whether something's real or not is just anecdotal evidence, right? You know, my teacher had schizophrenia and X, Y, and Z happen, right? When it's just kind of not real, right? So this is the ether in which our students who are on TikTok are swimming. And so what I wanted to do was to figure out how we could help train students to do this stuff a little bit better. And to do that, I developed a new seminar course, which was titled Communicating Psychological Science, where I wanted to go through and look at how we're actually teaching our students to communicate about psychology. And I'll just say, I'll share this syllabus with any of the folks who are watching today who want to get it later. So just bug the folks at Macmillan and I'll share that as a resource. But the idea behind this course was that as teachers in psychology, we do a lot of training our students to understand factoids in psychology. That's what most of our courses are. I think some of our courses actually do the job where we teach our students to create new facts in psychology. These are like research methods courses where students are collecting data and so on. But we don't spend a lot of time teaching our students how to talk about psychological facts. And this is something I worried about a lot, not just as a psychologist myself, but in my other role, communicating psychology as part of my podcast, The Happiness Lab. I think a lot about how we can translate findings in entertaining ways that people care about. And I was thinking, should we be able to teach our students these same kinds of methods? And so what the class was about was sort of giving students access to like best practices in communicating psychology in all the different domains in which we communicate psychology. So this would be things like an elevator pitch to talk about your study idea or explain a concept that you learned in a paper in like a 2-minute spot. It'd be thinking about how we communicate content with, say, juries and on public panels and to the government. But most of the time we spent thinking about how we communicate psychological concepts in media, in long form things like podcasts, but in the short form things like our students are consuming, like reels on Instagram, and especially, of course, on TikTok. And what I want to tell you about is 2 quick things that we did in the course that I think would be great examples that you could take into your own classroom that I think really helped students kind of fight the misinformation they see on TikTok. Activity number 1 that was really helpful was me going through and having students come up with popular TikTok activities or anecdotes or interventions that they see on TikTok and asking which of these are true and which of these are BS. And one of the primary examples that my students figured out was this idea that they see a lot on TikTok, the notion of manifestation manifesting, which if you don't know about manifesting, all over TikTok, but it's just this idea that if you envision a positive future, if you think about, meeting someone or having a goal or getting good grades, psychologically speaking, it'll activate processes that allow you to get closer to those goals. And while we know in research that positive thinking can be helpful, studies show that it's really dangerous. In fact, I was able to point students to studies by folks like Gabrielle Oettingen and others that show that the more positive fantasies you have about weight loss, the less likely you are to actually lose weight or eat healthier and so on. In part because these positive fantasies are mental imagery mistakes as really rewarding processes, so much so that we're less motivated to engage in those things that we've been thinking about in a positive fantasy. There's also evidence from Oettingen and others that the more you have positive fantasies about getting good grades, the less time you actually put into studying. It's as though the rewards we image really vividly become rewards that we experience. So I was able to show them these studies that show basically everything you're learning about manifesting is really wrong. But then that raised the question of are there any ways that we could manifest in a healthy way? And so students got to turn to work by Gabrielle Oettingen and others. She has a great book on this topic where she goes through a phenomenon that she calls mental contrasting, which is instead of just thinking about the positive things that you'll get, all the wonderful outcomes you'll experience, you then think about some of the obstacles that you might face. And you use mental imagery to think through a plan that could help you get through those obstacles. And Oettingen actually is a great science communicator herself. She has this little kind of acronym that she uses for best practices, which is you think about, it was called WOOP, W-O-O-P, but you think about your wish, you think about the outcome. That's the manifesting part, but you don't end there. You then image the obstacle really clearly and then the plan you could use to get through it. Why am I telling you all this? Well, I'm telling you all this in part because if we just looked at what TikTok said, it would be wrong, but wrong in this interesting, nuanced way. There's part of the manifesting that psychological research supports, but it gets wrong the exact intervention. And so students can see both that these kinds of communications have some truth there, which I think is what makes them so dangerous, but also that they're useful to figure out how we can do a little bit better. That was kind of activity number one. But the activity number two that I thought was even more fun for our students was to get them to create better advice on TikTok. I think an interesting thing about TikTok is, again, our students aren't just consumers of the information. A lot of them are creating this content themselves. The wonderful thing about TikTok is it's a democratic way to get your content out to anybody. But that means anybody with a phone or computer can create content that might just be complete lies, and I think, or just complete misinformation. And that's the kind of thing we see so much on TikTok. So I asked the question, what would it look like to get our students to be creating their own content that was evidence-based, but using all the best practices that you use on TikTok with emojis and little short videos and all the stuff that we as professors don't know, but our students know really well. And so this was the activity that I had our students do. Pick some misinformation topic on TikTok and make little short reels using all the kind of, clips of TikTok to do this a little bit better. And I was shocked just at how amazing students were at this, teaching them that you can add graphs in, right? Use all the kind of techniques that we know to communicate psychological information well, but do it in videos that look in the style of TikTok creators. And what was impressive to me was just how much the students resonated with these approaches and actually how effective they were. This is just one of our students, Crawford, who's actually a TikTok creator himself. But the videos he made that were on evidence-based processes were reaching 500,000 people on TikTok, right? So kind of fighting back to get back true evidence-based stuff, content out there on TikTok too. And so the point is, I think we should be training our students to diagnose what's wrong with the studies they're hearing on TikTok. But we also have a role to play, whereas if we can get our students to make their own evidence-based content, they might be able to combat some of the bad stuff that they're experiencing online too. And so that was my quick presentation. Thank you all so much, and I look forward to all your comments and questions.